Welcome, everybody. This is Bob Hollis with just a couple housekeeping tips for our webinar today. We appreciate you being here and are looking forward to a wonderful long series of webinars. So first of all, with GoToWebinar, we welcome questions. So put them in as they come to mind. Many of them might be answered during the conversation or a presentation, but still put them in as they come to mind. And that way, if they aren't covered, we'll know to get to those. If your panel happens to seem to have disappeared, you can use the open close button here, which is the orange button with the arrow. If you are unmuted by chance, keep in mind this webinar is being recorded. So know that when you're speaking on the webinar. And your little red circle here with the microphone will tell you if you're muted or unmuted. Because we have many coming in today and the webinar holds up to 1,000, everybody is muted by default. So if an organizer calls on you and wants you to speak, you'll be unmuted by an organizer. You can raise or lower your hand using this option here, and that'll bring us to your attention, or bring you to our attention, so we can either call on you or check for questions or need for technical support. And the bottom box here is where you would submit questions. So again, as they come to mind, go ahead and submit them, and we'll have plenty of time at the end left as well to answer any questions that we don't get to through the presentation. And with that, I'll turn it over to our organizer, Susan Collins with the Container Recycling Institute.
Bob, thank you so much. Thank you for all of your technical assistance and getting us all set up this morning. And welcome everyone to National Recycling Coalition's National Zero Waste Conference webinars. This is the second in a series, and this one is the National Product Policies Town Hall. We're very fortunate to have 6 wonderful panelists today. You can see their names here. We've got Miriam Gordon, Jamie Kaminsky, Clarissa Morosky, Scott Cassell, Heidi Sanborn, and Ruth Abbey. And I'll tell you the overall landscape of how this webinar fits in with something bigger that NRC is doing, which is this is a series of our Zero Waste virtual conference. There's a webinar series as well as the conference itself. So this is the schedule we've got of several webinars, and then in early December, I think it's the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, will be our National Zero Waste virtual conference. I also want to thank one of our sponsors in particular, who is the designated sponsor for this particular webinar. It's the Mattress Council. The Mattress Recycling Council is a nonprofit organization that provides recycling solutions for discarded mattresses, funds research, combats illegal dumping, and provides valuable resources for industry professionals. So you can visit them on the web at mattressrecyclingcouncil.org, all one word, Mattress Recycling Council. So I'll give an overview of how today's webinar is going to work. This webinar, again, is part of the National Zero Waste Virtual Conference. And our vision for this particular webinar is to have a conversation around all of these product policies as a national town hall, solicit your feedback, hear the discussion from all of the panelists, and everyone be listening for areas where we might have consensus or at least broad agreement. At the end of today's session, we'd like to do a recap and have each of the panelists give us their thoughts on where they did hear broad agreement or broad consensus, so that we have some ideas going forward of issues and policies that the National Recycling Coalition can tackle over the next year or work on over the next year. We're going to start with an introductory presentation from Ruth Abbey. She is going to introduce the various concepts that we're talking about today, so that we all know which concepts and policies we're talking about, and we also all have something of a common understanding of just briefly what those are. Then we'll have discussion and questions that are pre-prepared, that were advertised for this webinar. And then we'll also take questions from the audience for the whole panel, and we'll have plenty of time for your questions. So please do put your questions in the question panel. And again, on the items of consensus, we're really sort of looking for the top 3 items, because that's a workable amount that we can work on as we go through the next year. So with that, I want to turn this over now to Ruth Abbey. First, Ruth, just 1 minute. I forgot two things. We want to thank all of our sponsors for the National Zero Waste Conference. And again, remind you that it's December 1st through 3rd, and for more information, you can go here. So Ruth, what we want to do now is turn it over to you to give the introduction to the policies. And Ruth, we'd also like to have you share your screen so that you can use that PowerPoint presentation you developed.
Great. Bob, how do I share my screen? I think I missed that.
I just sent you a prompt.
There we go. Can you see it now?
It looks
good.
Great.
All right. Well, why don't I go ahead and do it from the start. So here we are at the National Policy Town Hall on product policies. I'm going to give a quick overview. This
Bruce,
is the zero. Oh, yeah.
We're just seeing a white screen right now. There we go. Now we're seeing your presentation.
Okay. And you can see the hierarchy?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. Well, let's just focus on that. So this is the hierarchy of highest and best use. This is developed with the Zero Waste International Alliance and a number of other zero waste focused NGOs from around the world. I just bring it here just to bring everybody up to speed on, zero waste is really about rethinking and redesigning first before reduce, reuse, recycle. And zero waste is kind of the overarching goal. And within that, we do have a concept called the circular economy. And so I wanted to just show you the image of the circularity that's promoted by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which essentially has both the biological nutrients on the left and the technical nutrients on the right, keeping in a circle. And I think that's what we want to promote when we're looking for sustainability and zero waste. Zero wasters would have a little bit of a beef with the item at the bottom, which is regarding leakage. Our goal would be to reduce as much leakage as possible to get to that goal of zero waste. Leakage here is shown as being landfilling and incineration, and our goal is to minimize landfilling and incineration. Because plastic is kind of I would say a proxy for our problem, I just wanted to show you the cumulative global plastic production, which is a big concern. This webinar is about all kinds of products and packaging, but I just wanted to give you kind of why we're kind of horrified about the current situation and our kind of barriers to sustainability. And this is another slide from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation that shows you a lot of problems currently with plastic production. Plastic production is increasing exponentially, and we are not capturing plastics for by and large for recycling or reuse. Only about 14% of plastics that are produced get back into the economic mainstream, either through reuse or recycling, and only 2% are in a closed loop system. So that's a problem. Here's a big long list of product policies, some of which we'll talk about today. Material product bans, both sale of certain products, collection or disposal, banning them at the landfill, voluntary or mandatory takebacks, advanced recycling fees, fees on single-use items. So these would not be advanced recycling fees, these on the bad stuff. And examples of that include things fees on bags, fees on cups. Mandatory rebates, we have that in the case of auto batteries. Deposit return systems, we also have that in examples, bottle bills, refillable bottles and containers, product stewardship, extended producer responsibility, and mandatory recycled content. And then this concept of cradle to cradle and product design. I did want to talk about the difference between product stewardship and extended producer responsibility. This definition is courtesy of the Product Stewardship Institute. So I'll just read it so we're all on the same page. Product stewardship is the act of minimizing the health, safety, environmental, and social impacts of a product and its packaging throughout all life cycle stages, while also maximizing economic benefits. The manufacturer or producer of the product has the greatest ability to minimize adverse impacts, but other stakeholders such as suppliers, retailers, and consumers also play a role. Stewardship can be either voluntary or required by law. And then extended producer responsibility, EPR, is the mandatory type of product stewardship that includes, at a minimum, the requirement that manufacturers' responsibility for its product extends to post-consumer management of that product and its packaging. And there are two related features of EPR policy: shifting the financial and management responsibility with government oversight upstream to the manufacturer and away from the public sector, and providing an incentive to manufacturers to incorporate environmental considerations into the design of their products and packaging. Back to the zero waste hierarchy, I kind of recategorized some of those product policies that we looked at into the hierarchy. So I just wanted to go over that very briefly. So on the rethink and redesign, I categorized material, products, and bans in the rethink redesign stage, also mandatory recycled content, product stewardship, focusing on those environmental life cycle impacts, and the cradle-to-cradle product design. On the reduce side, I also included material and product bans on the reduce side, and then fees on single-use items that might have the effect of reducing their impact. Product stewardship, again, with regards to the environmental impact of the redesign. And then reuse. This is an area where we have a lot of opportunity and a lot of discussion. Again, the fees on single-use items contribute to that, and also the refillable bottles and container programs. And then lastly, lowest on this stage of the hierarchy are the recycle and compost options, which include the voluntary and mandatory take-backs of items, the advanced recycling fees, the mandatory rebates for the automobile batteries, et cetera, the deposit return systems, and also extended producer responsibility in that classic sense of the management of the end of life of the product or packaging. So I'll turn it back to you, Susan, and see if Bob can help me stop sharing.
Perfect, Ruth. I'll give you a little bit of a break now, but thank you for framing that, and thank you for also putting together that framework. It was interesting the way you slotted everything into the hierarchy. I very much appreciated that. So we had a number of questions that we posed in advertising this webinar, and so we're going to go ahead and ask all of the panelists to weigh in on those questions here first. What I'll do is I'll call on somebody to start us off in the discussion, and then go through each of the panelists on each of these sets of questions. And if you feel like what you want to say has already been said, you can pass. You don't have to. There's no pressure to weigh in on every single one of these questions. But I'll start at the top. The first advertised question was: are bans and fees useful tools to encourage waste reduction, reuse, recycling, and composting? And do bans act like mandates to recycle or compost? And how effective have they been? And Miriam, I'd love to start with you. Would you like to talk about bans a little bit?
Sure. Bans can be very effective. When you ban a specific product, say you ban a plastic material, for example, or a plastic item like plastic bags, it can be effective in reducing those products entering the marketplace. And we've seen with in California, for example, with the plastic bag ban, that we've had in 1 year after California's state legislation that plastic bag litter on California's coast was decreased by 60%, according to coastal cleanup data. So it can be very effective. But the thing is that sometimes when you ban just one single-use product like plastic, what you get is an alternative single-use substitute. And we're seeing that a lot with plastic ban type legislation. And these substitutes can often be very regrettable. Things like paper, wood, and aluminum, and agricultural fibers used for compostable materials. Each of these products has, or materials has its own set of environmental impacts that can switch the environmental impact from, say, the ocean to climate change and resource extraction and public health. So what we generally espouse at Upstream is not a single material ban, but focusing on bans of all single-use products where there are better alternatives like more durable and reusable options.
Thank you, Miriam. I saw Jamie sort of nod with enthusiasm. Jamie, why don't you take it from here? Oh, Jamie, we can't hear you.
There we go. Yeah, that's exactly the same point that we have at Zero Waste Canada is if the intention is to eliminate the single-use product, you want to focus on not just a single material, but you're right, all single-use products. There's also on our side, we look at also disposal bans. So there's the material ban on the front end where you're banning a product like bags, for instance, single-use bags. But then there's also the ban at a waste ban. So you're basically banning materials from entering a waste stream. So transfer stations, dirty MRFs, landfills, and incinerators. For instance, for well-established markets, for instance, cardboard, for instance, is banned in our region for entering any of those systems. And what that does is that drives education from the waste hauler back to their customer to create source-separated systems for diverting that material for recycling or other purposes, or even reducing that material.
Great. Next, I want to go to Clarissa because I know you've had a lot of experience lately with the Single-Use Plastics Directive in the EU. Now we can't hear you, Clarissa.
Sorry. Agree completely with what Miriam and Jamie said, but I would also add that what we're struggling with really now at this critical moment in the next few weeks, is it really going to decide it, is, I mean, I agree about the plastics thing, focus on other single-use materials. But unfortunately, a lot of the policy is focused on the plastics. And in the European context, it is a plastics ban of single-use items. And the problem now is defining what constitutes single-use plastics. So there's two parts to that. And what we're finding, I mean, I'm happy to share with you position papers and more technical documentation on this, but what we're finding is that there is a massive loophole in the European current definition, which is effectively was pulled from other scientific laws that didn't pertain to the impact of single-use plastics in the environment. They were focused on something else. So it was like sort of sloppily pulling one definition and sticking it in a different law. And items like materials like lyocell, cellophane, viscose are all going to fall outside of that law, which means that they won't be banned. They won't have EPR fees levied on them, which means that some brands may ship to those materials, thereby not having to pay new EPR fees on those materials, and a whole other slew of things. I mean, even the 90% target on beverage plastic bottles, if you were to change to unscoped material, you could literally put these bottles and you'd have no requirement to get them back. So that is the number one issue, is how we define and ensuring that it has a proper scope.
Terrific. I'm going to go around the room to Heidi next.
So we were talking about bans?
Yeah, and you can pass if you want to save your time for other things. But
sorry, I thought I was going off the questions that I had pre-done here. I mean, I think it's pretty clear in Ellen MacArthur's foundation's outlined in their report about what to do. The first thing we have to do is get rid of the stuff we really can't do anything with. And that's the contamination in the system. We've got so many plastics and so much stuff out there. And I keep hearing, well, we have to educate the public to recycle better. And it's like, nobody's going to read a phone book to figure out how to recycle. It's not going to happen. We have to simplify the system, and it starts with the materials. And whether it's a ban or we make the cost so darn high that some of these materials cannot effectively be put on the market because the cost would be too high to get them back. Whatever the tool is, we've got to thin out the number of materials coming at us. It's just impossible to keep up with this the way it is.
Great. Okay, Scott, would you like to weigh in on bans and fees?
Yeah, just briefly here, I agree with the other things said. In terms of the bans, I would just add that there are certain materials like PFAS that are in products that make those products impossible, if you will, to recycle. So those are products or materials that should be banned. You might want to consider bans on the use of compostable plastics until there's a closed loop system that keeps them out of the recyclable plastic stream. And then in terms of fees, I think that depends on who's going to pay those fees. Is it the consumers or the producers? So shifting here into this other category of fees, depends on where the money is going. It could go into administrative costs in handling the system. And really the bottom line is whether or not there's going to be a change in behavior. So we see that the ban on plastic bags, you do need a fee on paper bags in order to change behavior and to encourage people into reusable bags. So I think that's the big thing, is looking at the results that we're trying to achieve.
Excellent. Ruth, you're the next up.
Yeah, and I think one area that's worth discussing with regards to bans and fees is enforcement. So we have really good examples of bans that work. Where bans don't work, it's because they're not being effectively enforced. State of Massachusetts, for example, has really good bans of all kinds of recyclable material, but we still see a lot of recyclable material in the trash. So, and it's just because of limited capacity for enforcement. So I think whenever we have a ban or a fee or any kind of regulatory scheme, we do have to think about the enforcement side of it.
Fantastic.
Can some of us, we were, in the beginning we were responding to the bans question, but I think there's more to be said about fees, and I'd love to have an opportunity to chat about that.
Yeah, go ahead, Miriam.
So I want to say that product fees or charges, some call them taxes, depends on how it's structured, have proven to be excellent ways to drive consumer behavior. In the case of plastic bag bans with associated charges for paper or just charges for plastic bags, this has been a really good, effective way to incentivize consumers to go for the reusable option. For example, in the city of Los Angeles, after they implemented a charge on paper bags and banned plastic, there is a 95% switch to reusable bags. And this is really consistent with social behavior research, which shows that consumers respond to having to pay more. They'll change their behavior to avoid paying more for a product, and they're less likely to change their behavior in response to incentives like discounts and loyalty programs. And in all the waste prevention policies that we're iterating at Upstream, we're currently focusing on taking advantage of this paradigm and launching policies that make single-use products more expensive than the unpackaged or the reduced or the reusable or refillable alternatives. And I think that's a really good policy principle to take advantage of.
Nice. Well, next I think I'm going to go to Clarissa. I'm teeing this question up for you. Because it is sort of connected to bans and fees and what incentivizes people. And it's I'll make an observation that as we're discussing all of this, there's really no one size fits all. The product and the policy sort of have to go together. There are different policies that are really effective for certain products. What you just described about carry-out bags, Miriam, was, it was the right policy for that product. So on the flip side of fees would be something like an incentive, a refund. So Clarissa, why is there more interest in deposits on beverage containers in recent years? And could container deposit programs help reduce contamination in recycling programs? So 2 questions there. We can't hear.
So the reason why there's more interest in container deposit systems are because we've sort of tried this curbside thing all over the world in different ways, and we're just not achieving the goals that we thought we'd get to. We should be at 85–90% recycling, especially in jurisdictions like Ontario, where you've had a financed blue box for like 20+ years, and it's not happening. So our current model is failing. Beverage producers are desperate for recycled content for plastics, cans, and glass, etc. And that desire is just growing and growing with new mandates and corporate commitments and everybody focusing on carbon footprints of packages. We have increasing targets globally all over the place. We're seeing more high targets, and we're seeing a massive visual plastics in the ocean piece, which was really topped out, I think, by the brand owner audit done by Break Free for Plastics, which really said, Coke, you're the worst, and Nestle, you're the second worst. And that really shaked up the brand. So This renewed interest is coming from the brand owners of beverage companies. Maybe not in America yet, but believe me, it's coming. And they're basically looking for a better option. And they know that the bottle bills work because the performance is undisputed. The real question now is how we're going to roll out bottle bills that are hitting 90, not 65, 75, 80, and where we, the producers, have full control and it's not being interrupted by government intentions to raise money for general revenues, etc. And we can get access to that material. So that's why we're seeing a change. What was part 2 of the question? Or
Sure.
did I answer it?
Part 2 was, could container deposit programs help reduce contamination in recycling programs?
Well, certainly, that's a big question. And I would say that I believe that the solutions for the future are not one system. It is not all about that residential curbside system. There are several loops that we have to create that are the most efficient loops for those products, those discard habits, those consumers and whatever. And we have to be a little bit more thoughtful than this one system approach. So with that, I would say that in our experience, the evidence shows that curbside and bottle bills can work very, very well together. They will help a jurisdiction achieve much, much higher collective targets. And they'll also support investment in recycling infrastructure at a more local level. So in many ways, that's good for curbside, actually.
Does anybody else want to add a little more to this? Oh my goodness, yes. Jamie.
Yeah, so I want to just make sure that when we're talking about deposit systems, that they're really primarily focused on just the collection side of things. They don't necessarily do anything in terms of redesigning the systems or helping to eliminate single-use products. So really, it'd be nice to be able, they're great for getting the materials back, but at the end of the day, we still want to try and push the producers to drive into refillable containers to reduce the waste that's created. So yeah, I do think that they work, but it's mainly to get the materials back. In terms of recycling, contamination or recycling system, that's assuming that bottles and cans are considered contamination in that recycling system. Some recycling systems that's completely okay with, but others it's not. So yeah, in those senses, a deposit is definitely part of that system of getting those out and reducing the contamination for sure.
So I've seen interest from nearly all of you. So I'm going to go to Scott next, and then Ruth, you'll be next. So go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, well, PSI strongly supports bottle bills that exist. And I myself, for 7 years, managed the bottle bill in Massachusetts. So I know it firsthand, and the fact that you get 3 to 4 times the rate of return as the non-bottle bill containers, high quality stream, consistent stream. So it's clear that it works. I think that the thing we need to focus on here in the US with the 10 states with the bottle bills and the others without, as we're moving to EPR systems for packaging, right now the packaging bills that are there, they're exempting, they're drawing a line and don't want to touch the bottle bill right now because of the debate that is, what is the value that the bottle bill either takes away from the curbside system? There's an issue here around value. And of course, there's value and there's costs. And not all the parties are seeing it the same way. So there's not a consensus right now. So I see that the 40 states that without the bottle bill, particularly in Washington, that's looking at an EPR bill, they're going to be looking at something like a bottle bill that gets that return, and they're complementary systems. So we know that in Canada and Europe, they're complementary systems. Clarissa, you know all about this. And we need to figure out how we can get that high rate of return, how we can take advantage of all the best practices that exist in the US and around the world in order to work those into an EPR system here in the United States.
Thank you,
And
Scott.
I just wanted to make the point, Susan, that we need these buyback and drop-off alternatives in order to get to the closed-loop systems that we desire for recycling. We can't get glass recycled into glass. A lot of plastic recycled into plastic, even paper recycled into paper, without that option for buyback and drop-off. So I think that we've relied on curbside and on-premises recycling, and it's in a lot of cases created some kind of a mess. And I think getting back to the opportunity, I would love to be able to recycle my bottles and cans locally. Can't do it right now. And I think that to an extent, our curbside programs have undermined our drop-off and buyback capacity and undermined our closed loop system.
I see that Heidi and Clarissa and Miriam also want to join in on this. Let's go in that order. Heidi and Miriam and Clarissa.
Thanks. I just want to clarify a couple of things. Really agreed with what Jamie said. I've always said deposit is just a tool to get material back. That's all it is. It's not a program. And we have to be careful with our language because I think we confuse people. You can have a deposit under a producer-run program. You can have a deposit under a government-run program. We can have curbside, but we can have curbside. There's totally different types of curbside. There's dual collection. There's, collection totally source separated. And again, how we talk about this is really important. These details really matter. We could do, I've been to Europe in several places where I'm sure Clarissa knows they've got everything source separated at the curb basically, and all the way down to the colors of glass. We don't do that here. We've commingled, and as Susan says, we scrambled the egg all up and we can't unscramble it. So, but that doesn't mean curbside's bad or not effective, and it doesn't mean we shouldn't have drop-offs either, but I think we have to be very careful. We have to look at the whole of the program because all these pieces fit together. And I know that, Ruth, the way you broke stuff out at the beginning, I'd actually challenge a couple of those things because they're not isolated in a program. They're things that have to be part of a bigger program. And so that's really where the rubber meets the road, is how do we get enough consensus around the whole of a program to get things passed that are going to work. And that's the challenge we've got in the US right now. So thank you.
Go ahead, Miriam.
Really good comments, Heidi. Oh, sorry. Really good comments, Heidi. I just want to do a quick pushback on two really important points. The idea that deposit return systems, as we know them, cannot incentivize design. That is actually not the case at all in Europe.
I did not say that, by the way.
No, I know you didn't. It was
Okay,
something Jamie said earlier. And it's maybe because he's a Canuck like I am, and all of the vast majority of deposit systems in Canada are financed by consumers. There's very little producer responsibility, truthfully. But the ones we have in Europe where it's full producer responsibility, they have introduced their own modulated fee system because that obviously makes sense. That's a fair and equitable way to divvy up the costs. And what we've seen is higher fees on green plastic and lower fees on white plastic. And there are actually guidelines that say you can't use this glue and you can't use this type of plastic cap. And I'd be happy to share the spec sheet with you, but it's like, if you as a producer want to participate in this amazing program that's getting 90% back, you have a design criteria and you can't go beyond that because we will not let you in. That's the kind of design incentives that we need to see. And on refillables, today, when you are competing with single-use containers that don't have a deposit, and refillables absolutely need a deposit, otherwise you can't get them back, you have no hope in hell. The only reason why Oregon has a standard refillable beer bottle, which is fantastic, is because they're piggybacking on an existing collection infrastructure, which has an equal playing field at the point of purchase. So my view is that we cannot achieve greater gains on refills unless it's underpinned by an equitable DRS on all single-use and multi-use beverage packaging. Now stop talking.
Yeah, we'll go to Miriam, and then I think we need to move on so that we can get to all the questions. And I hate doing that because this is such a great conversation. But Miriam, and then we'll move on to the next question.
Yeah, I want to agree with both Jamie and Heidi made the point that deposits are a really good method for collection, and we need them in all 50 states. But as Jamie made the point that this isn't a way. This is currently set up as a way to collect beverage containers, but doesn't establish a system for having refillables like we have in some in Oregon and in Germany and other places. So what we also need in tandem with the deposits are targets for having a portion of what's collected be refillables, and whether those targets are associated with local jurisdictions or producers. It depends on who's managing and has the responsibility for the system. But I think that is something that we also need. And I want to put a plug in for connecting the cap here, because it is really important that we collect all the plastic bottles that are where we're losing that somewhat valuable resource, that recyclable resource, and it's littering our beaches and our streets. But the caps must be connected, because that is another highly littered product. And so hoping to see that incorporated into bottle deposit programs or similar laws.
Great.
I just
Thank
want to make
you.
a quick rebut to Clarissa that when I'm talking about deposit fees, I'm talking about returning an item and getting money back, so encouraging collection. But I am aware of eco fees that are on the back end that drive the producers to do different things with their products. So to me, those are two completely separate mechanisms, and they do different things. So just wanted to point that out.
Good point. It should be added to the list. So we're going to switch subjects a little bit to recycled content. So the question here is, how effective have minimum content programs been, and what products have been required to have minimum content? And who would like to speak to that one? Okay, Clarissa, first hand I saw.
So I don't know if they've been very effective, but I'll just tell you a quick anecdote. There's been recycled content laws in California since, God, I don't know, like 20 years on plastic bags. And I can still remember in far off Ontario that our HDPE milk jugs were selling at a premium price back then, because they were all being shipped to California so that they could meet that minimum recycled content target. We've got new content laws in Europe, and there's a lot of work to try to make them effective. I think that they cannot be effective unless we have the same language, the same definitions, the same protocols, equivalent types of certifications, so that we can know that if we're claiming recycled content, these are real, legitimate post-consumer recycled content, tons. And if that doesn't happen, and I don't think it maybe has happened necessarily in California for the bottles that are currently under recycled content, if that doesn't happen, we just won't be successful. So it's the most important part of the process is basically coming up in the next 2 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll, as the moderator, I'll throw in, because I don't know if a lot of other people on this panel are familiar with the fact that we have some strong minimum content laws for glass bottles and for fiberglass in California of 30% and 35%. Those laws have been around for more than a decade, I think probably more than 15 years. And that has all, it went through a difficult time in the beginning, but it all worked itself out to the point where every year they're achieving more like 50% recycled content. And I don't think that can be said for glass bottles and fiberglass in the rest of the country. So I think it really does, it shows that they have been effective here. But I think I saw both Miriam and Heidi raise your hands. Do you want to talk to this issue? Did I get that?
I'll just quickly say that.
Okay, go ahead.
That we've got a newspaper law in the books as well that was highly effective at, and we've got one on the governor's desk right now that I think is going to pass and be signed by Assemblymember Ting. That's going to have some of the highest post-consumer content requirements in the world. I think we're going to. I think it was 30 or 15% by 2025 for some of the bottles and cans, and then going up to 50 by 2030. So this is, but the bill that was tagged by Cal Recycle as far as the cost to oversee this program is over $2 million. It almost killed the bill. So who verifies this? I don't think every state should be verifying recycled content. I think we need to have an international or at least a national standard and certification, because every state is not going to be able to afford this and pass bills, especially after COVID and the budget destruction that just happened. So I think they can be highly effective at driving markets, but passing a good one and then doing the oversight is really where the rubber meets the road, as usual.
Perfect. Miriam.
Well, I was going to say largely the same thing and mention AB 793, Assemblymember Ting's bill that's on the governor's desk for signature. So the only thing I would add is that there is a dearth of information on the California minimum content laws being reported by CalRecycle as to their effectiveness. Like, I mean, I could only find for glass that the two industries, glass containers and the fiberglass industry, have used 700,000 tons of recovered cullet annually. But as to the other programs, there isn't a lot of reporting. And so from a policy perspective, we need more measurement and evaluation of the effectiveness of these programs. But they're good ideas. We need them.
Great. Thank you, Miriam. That's a good observation. Scott, what did you want to add?
From our discussions on packaging EPR around the country, one of the areas of major consensus is that we need recycled content standards or recycled content in the products to drive demand. So this is from producers, it's from recyclers, it's from end markets, it's from governments. Those can be put into eco-modulated fees, and that's one of the sort of areas that tips us from where we are right now into those fees being, standard on materials by weight, even recycling costs. Moving into that eco-modulation, I think that that's a really good candidate to put into the EPR bills as fees that are variable that the producers would pay. So if there's a higher level of recycled content, they pay lower fees.
Perfect.
And I'll just quickly add, I think we passed the first one in the nation, eco-modulated fee here in California on carpet last year, and it was fought tooth and nail by the carpet industry. They did not like that at all. So again, these are very, very difficult policies to pass. And we have to find enough support and understanding amongst the advocates to get these over the line and make sure they work.
Yeah.
At some point,
go ahead.
At some point, I hope we get to talk about programs that many in industry are putting forward as recycling, and how specifically thermal conversion and pyrolysis of plastics, and how they might drive against these goals of having enough available recovered material to meet new recycled content requirements for plastic beverage containers in particular, because I think that I haven't seen anything about what do we define as recycling in the questions, but that's certainly pyrolysis and thermal conversion of waste and plastics in particular is something that many in the plastics industry are trying to put forward as a form of recycling. It's worth discussing at some point.
Okay. I do want to move on to the next question, if you'll let me, which is the last of the preset questions that we had in advertising this event. And it's, are extended producer responsibility programs best used for hard to recycle materials? Should EPR programs be used for printed paper and packaging? And what criteria should be required as part of any new EPR law? Ooh, that's a big one. Scott, I'm going to start with you on those general questions about EPR, especially because you have the guidebook available.
Thanks. Big question, lots to talk about here. I'll just keep it focused. First, those who opposed EPR, and it's been 15 years now that we've been working on EPR for packaging and printed paper here in the US. It's finally happening, and there's going to be a flood of EPR laws, hopefully, that pass next year. There's about a dozen states that we're working with now and over the past couple of years. So those who have opposed EPR for packaging in the past have used this argument. Hey, we support EPR for hard to manage waste. It's great, the toxics, the carpet, the mattresses, the paint, all these other things. Great for that, but not for packaging. Well, EPR works for all products. We're talking about internalizing the external costs. So it's really a principle here of fairness. It's a way to get the producers and the consumers to pay for the real costs of all the products and packaging. There's 35 years of experience around the world on packaging in Europe and 15 years or more in Canada on EPR for packaging and printed paper. So we know that these EPR systems work. They're growing around the world, South America, all over the world. So this would not be happening if these systems don't work for packaging. Now, we have put together an elements document. We call it a framework, 20 different elements that allows a discussion to take place, because there's a lot of discussions that I see in the States, and the ones that go on and on and on don't have a framework within which those conversations can take place. So what we've provided ourselves through conversations with the experts on EPR in all the different states around the country, we've put together 20 different elements that must be considered, like the scope of the products, where the packaging would be collected from, how you define a responsible party, what the convenience standards are, what the performance standards are, etc. So this is a tool for making decisions, and that's what I feel has been most missing from the discussions. But once you get that framework together and have people around the table and can facilitate the discussion, then you start understanding the hauler's perspectives, the producer's perspective, local governments, which have investments already made, as do the waste management industry. And it gives you an opportunity to see the give and take that's needed in order to come to a consensus. Each state is going to be different on this, but when you look, you step back, about 80 to 90% of the discussions are exactly the same, and then they're going to be nuanced for each different state.
Scott, just really briefly, tell the audience where they can find the tools that you just mentioned.
On our website, and I will provide a link to you to send it out for others after this call.
Very good. I'd like to go to, oh goodness, Heidi and then Jamie.
Thanks. So I think the question started with, should we do EPR for these different materials?
Right.
And we're not saying at the National Stewardship Action Council that everything should have EPR. What we're saying is, look at all your policies that you have as options. And if you think that we can get the best outcome with an EPR approach, then look at EPR, but you have to look at making sure you've got the right details in the bill to get the outcomes that you're looking for. Is it source reduction? Is it recycled content? Is it, collection? Is it designed for repairability? But you have to design each law. That's why I keep saying the devil is in the details of these laws. There is not one EPR model. And the California CalRecycle has on their website an EPR framework outline of what should be in a checklist of what should be in a bill to make sure they can enforce an EPR program. And I've already discussed it with others that are experts, and it's already outdated. We need to update it probably. But it's a constantly changing thing, and the few of us that are in this field, I highly encourage people, if you're thinking of doing this, one, to reach out to us, because this is not easy to figure it out, especially politically. But two, I would ask the manufacturers, if you don't want this to happen in a disharmonized way, state by state, then you better start leading, because we've said this for 15 years. If you're not at the table, you're going to be on the menu. The time is coming when something's going to get done, and it's either with you or in spite of you. And if you lead, the chances of getting harmony are much better. And I think paint and mattresses are good examples of how the industry came to the table and they started actually guiding this. And in California, we got the hardest bill maybe ever on pharmaceuticals and needles on a pure EPR model, because the industry came to the table because they could see we were disruptive and that we were passing them county by county. And that was exactly what I warned them we'd do. So that's a strategy also to get what you want, is to start taking this county by county, which was litigated to the US Supreme Court. So everybody can now do that with the public health and safety nexus. And I do believe we have that now with packaging, because we're finding bits and pieces of plastic in all of us, in our water and in our air. And I do think now packaging would fall under the health and safety determinant for local rule.
Okay, So I'm going to try to monitor the time a little more closely because we've gone through 50 minutes and we do want to be able to get through the questions. We've got a longer list here and also the questions from our audience. So if we could try to be 30 seconds to a minute in the responses. Ruth, why don't you go next?
Yeah, and I would also like to make sure that Jamie gets in on this. I think that the big concern that we have with EPR strategies are twofold. One is the lack of transparency. And, if it's all in the private sector and a product steward, we don't really have access to information the way we could in the government scheme. I think the other concern would be lack of access to the materials for entrepreneurs. We do need to have closed loop systems, and I'm not sure always that brands or brand owners or manufacturers are the best at the entrepreneurs for making sure that they can do those closed loop systems. And then I think the other sort of major concern is that I've been on the board of a recycling lobbying organization for 20 years, and we can never get the bill we want. We can absolutely never get the bill we want. So the idea that we can invent an EPR law that will actually work for these really strong, fundamental pieces of our economy, I just don't think so. Hard to recycle, pharmaceuticals, paint, sure, but the big, movers and shakers of our economy, the oil industry, really, I just don't think it's going to happen. So the idea that we can get the bill that we want, I think, is an impossible idea. That's my concern. But I would defer to Jamie, who's living under EPR scheme.
I think we've evolved past EPR, what it started out as, because it started out as a litter bill, to be honest. It's just to collect the materials and to prevent it from going into the water and the oceans and stuff. But after that, whatever happens with it, as long as it's managed somewhat responsibly, that's okay, it seems, especially for hard to handle stuff like oil. Oil could be recycled into new oil, but a lot of it gets incinerated. So there's a lot of issues around that with EPR, where you're giving the control to one entity to do what they want with it, and there's very little oversight. So for hard to handle stuff, yeah, I think it's important to make sure that there's a place for those, a consolidated place for those things to go. Could that be handled with other government entities or government restrictions? Possibly could. I always say that for all the other materials, if EPR actually worked, I look at the bottle EPR Encore system here in BC, which is one of the oldest in North America. And I always tell people, if it actually worked, every drink container would be refillable today, and also there would be no such thing as gable tops or Tetra Paks. They would have been phased out and designed out of the system. So and that's an old program. If you look at the oil container system, it's not even a consumable product, yet we're collecting those containers just to destroy them. So really what I see EPR as is collect and destroy, recycling, and then if you can't recycle it, you incinerate it afterwards. They don't drive anything else. They don't look at reuse. They don't look at refill. Those are dirty words because they're all controlled by the producers and manufacturers.
And I would argue that's about how the law is set up.
Miriam, go ahead, and then.
Yeah, I'd love to add on to that. I certainly agree with Jamie on that. And I think when we talk about what the criteria should be for EPR for packaging, it should be that waste prevention needs to be a priority. It's always been a priority in the language, but not in the targets established in EPR programs. And so if we're going to design new EPR programs, we need to build waste prevention targets into those programs. And they need to be not weight-based, because reducing by weight encourages lightweighting encourages plastics. But we can build in targets. For example, the new anti-waste law in France has established a national target of 5% refillable, building to 10% refillable packaging units by 2027. There's no reason why we cannot have those kinds of targets attached to producers or whoever has the burden in the EPR program. And the other criteria that I think that we need to build in, be very careful about in terms of EPR is what is recycling. And I'm going to go back to that point that I made before. We need to make sure that there have been many industry attempts in California to qualify thermal conversion and incineration as a form of recycling and pyrolysis, and we just cannot let that be in the criteria of what's recycling. We cannot move towards that format because none of those programs have actually created materials to put back into the recycling system. Currently, pyrolysis only is a plastic to fuels program, and that is not recycling. What we're generating is more fossil fuels.
Right. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead, Scott.
I'd just make a quick thing here because, so first of all, no governments are going to allow pyrolysis as recycling right now. It's not on the table.
Burning in cement kilns, though, they allow that. Sorry.
I'm saying in terms of counting for a recycling rate and a recycling target, this is not happening. The chemical recycling that you're talking about is a big concern for state and local governments. And of course, the producers are pushing this, and we have to leave our minds open that there might be a new technology that can come into place, and whether or not it's more like mechanical or more like chemical or more like pyrolysis, we haven't seen it yet in all the discussions, but it's out there. So I agree with your concerns on this, but I think there's a fundamental even misunderstanding about what EPR is for the experts here on the panel. And I think that we also need to educate ourselves about what EPR is, because there are models. There will be bills passed next year. The producers know that. That's why they're coming to the table. The model we developed is in the federal Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. It's in Vermont. It's in Maine to a certain degree. It's in New York. It's in all the states that are around. They're borrowing it. They're using it. There's a harmonization because these are the governments that have been working on this for 15 years. And it can work on packaging. It will. Will it be perfect? No. Will we get what we want? Hopefully we can work that political process so that we can get as much as we want. And the eco-modulated fees aren't even in place right now. That's like the future even in Europe. So we're trying to change into a system that is moving. Thank goodness it's moving, but it's finally here that after all these years, there are bills that are on the table that are happening, they're going to pass. And I would encourage all of us to really get in there with your interests. I think reuse, that can definitely be part of it. It needs to be more. I agree with you, and I'd like to work with you, both of you, on source reduction, on reuse. How can we use an EPR system and maximize those? Because everyone wants to do that from the government side and environmental groups as well. And how we got to get down into the details here about how to make that happen.
Thank you, Scott. I'm definitely hearing, and I hope everybody's taking their notes. Remember, we're going to do the wrap up at the end and find where we have areas of broad agreement so that we have a little list of the top 3 things that NRC can be working on over the next year. And part of what I'm hearing from all of you is sort of EPR 1.0 versus EPR 2.0, that there was a good start with the programs, but that we learned a lot of things and learned that there's a lot of new layers and features that we need to purposefully design into the programs. So Clarissa, I'm going to ask you a question about a plastic tax, a suite of questions. There's a lot of talk around the world these days about a plastic tax on virgin resin to be levied on brands based on the packaging they put on the market. This tax is seen as a policy instrument to stimulate the market for recycled resin, effectively offering a price advantage. The more recycled content you use, the less tax you pay. Do you agree? And if so, why or why not?
So I can see why this is, the theory behind this is really to try to close that gap and allow recycled resin, when it's more expensive than virgin, to thrive. But it just doesn't work, because at the end of the day, you're chasing an economic marginal gap, and that gap is changing every single day. So there's no way you can ever catch up to it. You're always going to be behind, and you're never going to be able to create that economic incentive for producers to procure more recycled resin. So the whole idea of trying to solve the problem of getting producers to procure recycled resin is not going to be solved by a tax. And yes, a tax can raise revenues for your government, and if you want to impose it on plastics for whatever reason you want to impose it, fine, but at least let the goal of the tax be one to generate revenues, never one that's going to solve the recycled content process. And I hear about it and I put it on the list of questions because we're talking about it now in Europe in a major way, anywhere from like 45 cents per kilo to on pet to 88 cents per kilo.
Oops.
So it looks like Clarissa might have frozen a little bit, and I see that Heidi had a hand raised. So Heidi, would you like to add something?
Thank you, Susan. Yeah, first of all, taxes are highly unpopular, especially in the US. But my question is, why are we even talking about this until we remove the subsidies for oil and gas? We are not getting to the root of the problem. We are making it cheaper by giving our land, giving them tax breaks, and then we wonder, I mean, why are we taxing it on the back end when we're subsidizing it at the front end? The government isn't going to be making any sense. We need to remove the subsidies. That alone is going to be more of a free market, because right now we don't have a free market. We have a subsidized market for old, dirty energy sources and materials, and that has got to stop. So I think we need to really refocus our efforts on that first.
Fantastic. Miriam, can you answer very briefly? Or you sounded like you wanted to weigh in on this one, or maybe not. No. Okay.
No,
okay. Clarissa, you didn't really get a chance. What's that?
I'm just in furious agreement with Clarissa and Heidi on this.
Okay, so that was like a celebration fingers. Clarissa, you didn't really get a chance to finish.
No, just to say that it's coming up a lot now when we're having sort of higher level conversations about this recycled content business. And, you know, everyone's like, oh, what a nightmare. How the hell are we going to do it? How are we going to track it? What's certification? It's got to be international. Why don't we just put a tax and then we can sort of solve that? That is not the solution. We have, if we want producers to procure recycled content, quality recycled content, we have to tell them you have to procure X amount of recycled content based on what you produce. Bottom line. And we have to figure out the technical side and work together, all of us actually, making sure we get it right. I think there's an amazing agreement on the chemical recycling thing, that chemical recycling shouldn't be considered as recycled content. That will be a fight, like guaranteed, absolutely going to be a fight. And ACC is going to lead it over in your neck of the woods, and Plastics Europe is going to lead it over in my next neck of the woods.
Okay, Jamie, you can go ahead and weigh in on this, but I also want to ask you a question about refillables just as soon as you're done. So we're going to switch to the topic of refillables and reusables in just a second. So go ahead.
Okay, well, I was going to loop back onto recycled content because I agree with Heidi for sure, what she said about removing subsidies for oil. But with recycled content, I like the idea. The concept sounds great. The only concern is to make sure that it doesn't compromise durability and reusability of products. So that's the only thing that you got to make sure, that it's not degrading the quality and perpetuating more single-use products.
Great. Let's stay with that, Jamie. One of your key topics to talk about was, how do we develop policies that drive organizations toward refillable and reuse supply chains over single-use disposable supply chains? And really connected to that also is what policies can be in place to drive quality, durable products with lower toxicity that will last longer, that are repairable, and at the end of their life recyclable. That's to you, Jamie.
Oh, that's directly to me. I'm answering my own question. That was to the panel. So really, yeah, so it's a tough question. So a lot of it has to do with everything we've been talking about. So banning of single-use items. Anytime there's an EPR program that's actually in place or getting set up, it needs to be a focal point. So we really need to make sure that that's the priority. So all these discussions, everything we're talking about, education, just everything we're doing has to focus on that top end. And then we're looking at recycling at the end of it. Right now, everyone's looking at recycling first, maybe possibly a little bit of reuse in there. And then, you know, at the end of the day, they're disposing of it. So EPR, for instance, in BC, that's exactly what they do, recycling first. and then they're shifting to trying to create refuse-derived fuel. So they're trying to create engineered fuel for cement kilns and things like that with the remainder. Put lots of funding towards that, and then once that's set, they're not going to change their model. They're going to keep going with that because people seem to be okay with it. Calling them zero waste depots, and organizations saying that soft plastics and crinkly plastics are getting recycled when they're just all getting burned. So it's really important to make sure that it's top of the conversation and that we're not getting distracted by all these years and years of trying to figure out what policy to make to get more and more recycling, which is obviously great, but at the same time we spend so much of our energy on that policy and not enough time on really looking at what we want, which is reuse, refillable. It's more controlled. You can have it local. It creates more jobs. There's so much more value in there.
Miriam, you'd like to weigh in?
Yes, I agree with you, Jamie. And I'd just like to add that in the answer to how do we drive towards refillable and reuse supply chains, our policies historically have mixed reuse and recycling together in program priorities, like having targets for our waste needs to be 75% reduced and recycled, and you cannot get towards waste prevention, towards reduce and reuse, when you mix the target together with recycling. So we need to have separate targets for waste prevention, for reduce, reuse, refillable, and that has to be the priority, consistent with the zero waste hierarchy that Ruth showed in the slides. We have not done that anywhere globally. Prioritizing the reduce and reuse at the very top over collection, recovery, and recycling. So all of our policies need to do that. They need to set targets for how much will be reduced and how much will be reused. And we can talk about different product categories and what makes sense. But I also want to say that we need to focus on the reduce side. We need to focus on unpackaging products. There are definitely policies out there that are promoting unpackaging. For example, last year, California passed a law that tells the hotel industry that they have to stop providing single-use toiletries to consumers and put everything in refillable dispensers. Totally awesome. That's the kind of policy that we need. We need those things in the food service industry. We need to go sector by sector and look at how to unpackage, how we deliver products to consumers. Unpackage first, and then if we can't unpackage, the delivery system needs to be refillable or reusable where possible. And when we can't find solutions that fall into the reduce or the reuse refill, then we focus on how do we manage the waste so that it's recyclable and circular. That would be my prescription. Thanks.
Great. Okay, Clarissa, I'll let you have the last word on this. Then I have something I want to ask of Ruth. Go ahead.
Just to
Clarissa.
say that, targets are a great idea, but let's just face it, like this is just not going to happen in America. We're having trouble enough doing it in Europe. I mean, the home of the refillable. You guys haven't had refillables in any significant way in over 20 years. We have the data, and it's pretty shocking, actually, unlike many other countries. So this idea of targets, levying a target on a producer in America, it's just not going to work. But what can work is to start to educate again on how these refillable systems work. Because at the end of the day, any producer that wants to go into a refillable system is going to have a huge capital investment because they've got to buy an entire float of reusable, strong, durable, reusable packaging. They got to buy the crates. They got to figure out their collection system. They got to get consumers to return and participate in that collection system. That is exceedingly challenging. And I mean, look at Loop. Everyone loves the idea of Loop. They've got individualized packaging. It's not standardized. It's not making any money. It ain't even close to making any money. There's obviously interest in it, but it's all about letting producers know what's involved, and if there's any way to pilot some of these projects, demonstrate these projects, talk to manufacturers that want to pivot into reusable plastic packaging or reusable, God knows what packaging. These are kind of the inspiring conversations that we as a group have to start having, because to talk about targets, never going to happen. You're not going to see it in Europe for at least 5 years on the positive
I mean, I think
side.
the moderator's prerogative here to throw something in and then also to pivot to a question for Ruth, which was, I was really inspired by what I've learned about Oregon's refillable bottle system, where they employed a bit of brilliant financial engineering. They turned the system around by removing that barrier you were just talking about, Clarissa, which when individual producers have to purchase the float, they have to have enough bottles to always have enough in the system. And the Oregon OVRC system, the system operator there, came up with a new idea that hadn't been tried before, where they took on, as the system operator, took on as a system responsibility purchasing the refillable bottles that are shared by everyone. And in essence, the producers just rent the bottles essentially every time they use them. And I'm bringing this up because that kind of creativity and innovation can help us break down some of these barriers when we think of it in a system-wide way. But with that, we've got a couple of other really great topics that we need to get in. So I'm going to pivot over to Ruth. Ruth, I want to ask you about a bill that just failed in our legislature, a pair of bills, SB 54 and 1080. And your question was there confusion and fear over the EPR provisions, an underlying factor in AB 1080's failure to pass the Assembly for a second time? And in order to answer that, you're going to have to tell people on this webinar, because a whole bunch of them are not from California, you're going to have to tell them a little bit about what that bill was and why it didn't pass.
Yeah, I mean, the hope for those bills, this is Senate Bill 54 and Assembly Bill 1080, was to be like the circular economy bills in Europe, and to address, our goal was source reduction, reuse, and it had a very major goal. It evolved because legislation is not pretty. It evolved to be plastic focused, and it evolved, the original intention was to be material neutral. It evolved to be plastic focused, and it set recycling goals for these products, and sort of source reduction was kind of left by the wayside. And some of the big opposition to those bills came from the curbside recyclers, the haulers in Southern California particularly, that felt as though they would be out of the loop in terms of marketing their own material. And so that is kind of a big concern that folks have about EPR, is it takes away the opportunity for the entrepreneurship for me to be able to sell my material to whomever I want if I collected them. So I think that CalRecycle did request and did include some major provisions for EPR, if the program were to go to an EPR strategy, what that EPR requirement would be. And I think that we aren't settled in this part of the world on the fact that EPR is going to work. And I think it mainly is because who do you trust? Are you more likely to trust the government, the local government, the state government, or, you know, the oil companies, you know, the manufacturers, right? And so putting that trust, you know, as, you know, messed up as, you know, government is, right? It's, to me, it's one of those things. It's kind of the best of what we got. I would much rather, you know, trust the bureaucracy, trust the local governments than I would the manufacturers in doing the right thing, because they will always go to the least common denominator, go to the, you know, cement kilns or the chemical recycling. They'll always prioritize the worst thing first. And so I think, in answer to the question, I do feel as though the EPR provisions were a hazard in those bills. I also think its emphasis on recycling and plastics and not in materially neutral and source reduction and reuse kind of made it, the environmental folks that were supporting the bill, a little less excited about getting it passed.
Okay, we'll go to Heidi and then Miriam on this one. Go ahead, Heidi.
Yeah, I agree with the opposition. Part of the problem was that the bills kind of went underground for months, and then all of a sudden popped up in late August as a plastics only bill, and took out the source reduction, which is what a lot of us were really excited about. So, and I understand why they did it. These are extremely hard bills, as we've talked about. And the waste haulers, if you're gonna, you know, take on a bill that's gonna really upset the waste haulers and they don't see how they fit in, I pretty much guarantee you it's not gonna pass. So at least in our state. So I think, again, this is where we'll talk about this, the Recycling Commission comes in, because we've got to find something that we can get the majority of stakeholders to support, that we can hand to the legislators, because at this point we're getting thin on legislators who even want to carry these bills because they can't figure out which way to go. If they go this way, all these people are shooting at them. If they go that way, everybody else is and they can't feel like there's a win. And then why take that on? So we as stakeholders have to come together, and this is where the manufacturers and all the stakeholders need to start talking, because as I said, we are not going to get good policies if we don't all work together. We're just not, because they know more than we do about how they run and what's in their stuff, and we have this other side, but together we're going to come up with a better program, and we're running out of time to do that on packaging. As Scott said, I think we're going to see a lot of legislation next year, and they're going to have a big disharmonized mess in the US if they don't start leading.
Heidi, hold that thought, because I'm going to come back to you next and ask about the commission. But Miriam, let's hear from you on this topic of SB 54 and AB 1080.
Yeah, well, we ultimately upstream did not end up supporting it because it was plastics only in the end, which I said in the beginning why that's a problem for us. We need to be addressing all single use, and because it lacked any source reduction goals. But another thing that I worry about with you know, these big plastics and circular economy bills in a state like California is that the devil is in the details. Once you got the legislation passed, it's going to be like another 5 to 7 years in the regulatory process of hammering out the details. And so from our perspective, we're just getting a lot more progressive policies at the local level. And our focus is on reducing single use in different and how we deliver products to consumers, and showing that you actually can do it with reusables and refillables. There's a lot of new businesses entering this space, and there's a lot of consumer excitement about it. I didn't really agree with Clarissa on that. I know we haven't done refillables in the US for decades, but I feel like the time is right now. And a lot of the real progressive policies are going to bubble up from the grassroots, and we're already seeing that. But I was really disappointed in this legislative process.
Scott, can you weigh in on this quickly, and then we'll get back to Heidi on the statewide commission?
Sure. I just wanted to mention that there's a lot of agreement, believe it or not, statewide around the country in the type of EPR bills, the types of elements that should be included. One of the main issues that a state needs to decide is what Ruth mentioned, and I think Miriam as well, and Heidi also, is that the haulers have significant interests. They have sunken investments, as do many municipalities themselves, and that leans towards keeping the current system. And frankly, it leans towards a system that Quebec has had for 15 years, which we call municipal reimbursement. So that's kind of, we call it a fork in the road of these EPR bills, and we spell it out in a seminal report that we've developed, and we'll make that available to everybody if you haven't seen it. But there is a fork in the road here, and it's not one way or another. It's kind of a gradation, and it's the discussions and negotiations and deep interests that exist from the hauling community, the recyclers, as well as the municipalities. But then you have producers who have their own interests. They're saying, hey, if we're going to pay for this system and pay for as much as you want, then we want more control. So there's going to be a gradation here between the producers on one hand that have tremendous power. You're right, Ruth. They've got it, but we want them to fund these systems. Then you have the haulers and the recyclers on the other hand, tremendous power, political power. They've been the backbone of the recycling industry, municipalities that have been doing this forever. But there is a way to come together around this, and it could be starting with one type of system and transitioning to another. But it's this degree of control that we really need to focus on. And that will be where each of you as states come to your agreements and find what Heidi is suggesting is we need to get together. The legislator wants to have a bill delivered to them that says, we've got the majority or everybody on board with this. It's going to be around this issue at least.
Thank you, Scott. Heidi, so people on this webinar don't know a lot about the statewide commission. And I think one of the crazy benefits that has come from all of us doing everything on Zoom these days, you know, the whole not doing things in person, is that suddenly people in other states are able to benefit from, you know, participating in webinars that they never would have been on. Scott, your webinar yesterday had participants from all over the world. So Heidi, if you could tell people a little bit about the Statewide Recycling Commission, about the goal around achieving 75% diversion, the market development, policies that you think that we can get consensus around, and how people from other states can listen in on that conversation, because it's the commission, it's the committees, and there are a bunch of very rich conversations happening. So Heidi, can you tell us more about that?
Thank you. So last year, Assemblymember Susan Eggman passed a bill that created the California Commission on Curbside Recycling and Recycling Markets. And it was tasked with doing a bunch of different things. We have multiple different goals. The commission was established in June. We had our first meetings in July. I was elected chair by the 17-member commissioners. Vice Chair Vallier is a supervisor in Alameda County. He also runs Tri-Sud Disposal. So we have a great group of people on this commission. And we decided very early that we had a lot to do to make policy recommendations to the legislature by January of next year. We have 2-year appointments. And what we're doing is it's got waste haulers like Recology and Waste Management. We've got rural counties represented, urban counties like LA and Del Norte is rural, and a broad group, but we don't have manufacturers. And so we have put out a call. I've been in Resource Recycling Magazine and here and everywhere I say, all of the commissioners are doing it, trying to say that in California, as 12% of the market, if this group of people can come together, and our goal is consensus recommendations for 17 people, and if we get consensus around anything, that's a big deal. And those recommendations will go over to Cal EPA and the legislature, hopefully for the beginning of the 2-year session next year, of the legislative session. We are tasked with figuring out some recommendations around how we're going to achieve our 75% diversion goal, which we're supposed to be meeting this year, and we're going backwards. I think we're in the 30s now, so it's really not going well there. Our greenhouse gas goals, because our methane emissions and organics are a very big part of that. And then the organics diversion goals, we're tasked with meeting markets. And I've had an actual conversation with Susan Eggman, Assemblymember Eggman, about what if you had a magic wand, what would the commission do? And she said everything. I want clean, not uncontaminated materials. I want the public to feel clear, like they're understanding how they recycle. I want, markets, all the stuff that we all talk about. So we're kind of unlimited, and the group is working really hard. We've got 4 committees. You can go to calrecycle.ca.gov and Google in the Recycling Commission, and it'll pop up the page. We've set up a listserv that's just for the commission. So we send out the agendas, we send out all the public comments are posted. This is as transparent as we can possibly make it. We don't want to hide the ball, and we want input. There's a comment portal that you can email very specific policy proposals that you wish for us to consider. I encourage everyone, I don't care where you are in the world or what stakeholder group you represent, we need it all. And we will then refer some of the comments to the committees. We have an organics committee, recycling, labeling and media, and market development, which I am on. And the committees then make recommendations to the commission, and then the commission will take them up, and then they will go into the report. We've already started building the report brick by brick, and it's all there. Everybody's going to see it. It's all on the web. We're not hiding anything. We want consensus. So I encourage everybody, to do that. We heard a lot about, you know, groups wanting EPR, another group saying, well, that's not what we want. But this is how we've got to have a transparent process that everybody can agree to something, because otherwise we keep fighting each other and we're getting absolutely nowhere. We have got to use this tension to have a breakthrough and go in the same direction. This is unsustainable what we're doing in this society right now and around the world. So I'm very hopeful, and the commissioners I know are working very hard, and I'm really proud of everybody. So I encourage you to submit your comments.
Heidi, can you wrap up with letting people know how to get onto you can get on the webpage and you can find the commission materials?
Yes, and I can send those to you, but if you go to www.calrecycle.ca.gov, the third scrolling picture is the commission. Just click on it and it'll take you to the commission page. That's where all our meeting notes are, our meeting agendas, the comments we've gotten so far, and the listserv link. So you can just sign up, so your email, you're automatically getting updates from us about what we're doing, and the portal for public comment.
Right, and as well as future meetings, so that people can put the meetings on their calendar and actually, you know, watch it on their own screen. Thank you, Heidi. Thank you for that. So we have
next Wednesday.
Okay. So we have a ton of questions from the audience. We've got 105 people on. We've got another 20 minutes or so before we start going into the wrap up. The first question is for you, Scott. Can Scott explain how he thinks the producers are funding the EPR system? I think it is more accurate to say they are investing in the system, but it's the consumers who ultimately fund it. Emphasizing this would drive the kind of accountability and results Ruth advocates. Your response, if you'd like, Scott?
Yeah, sure. So the way that producer systems for packaging are funded is we call cost internalization. That means that they are charged per material by weight right now. And sometimes we're advocating for the cost that material incurs on the recycling system. And then there can be other elements added to those systems, like recycled content, which might reduce that fee for them, or reusability or refillability. I think that's where some of the reuse and source reduction can come in. It could be on greenhouse gas reduction, and so there's lower fees. So each time they're by weight, these producers would be charged on those materials, and it would go into a fund, and we can have a day-long discussion in terms of who manages that fund and what are the best options or experiences around the world. But the producers do pay. Now, whether they pass it on directly to the consumer or not is up to the producer. That's why it's internalization. It's left up to the producer whether or not they cut their costs in some other part of their business, or whether they pass it on. From our Canadian colleagues, at least what we're hearing is there's no evidence that we have seen or they have seen that any of these costs are increasing the cost of the products themselves. Now, if that is seen by the consumer, sure, we want the consumer to be paying for that cost if that's what it is. But what many experts around the country, the world, are saying is that these systems, because they're a network, and they can reduce the cost of the overall system. There's such inefficiency in our system right now because it's fragmented that there may not be added costs. As a matter of fact, there may be value in this at the end of the day, where we're investing money up front and causing greater value in the back end. So right now, I know that's a big issue for legislators. Oh my gosh, we can't have these systems because consumers are going to pay more. There's no evidence. Some of the studies that I've seen, it doesn't exist, and it may even go the other way in having value.
Scott, that's great. And you did just host a webinar yesterday on the subject of eco-modulated fees. Is that webinar, is there or will there soon be a recording of that available? And you also had some documents, some reports that had been written that you provided as resources. Are those available on your website, or?
Those are available for free. This was a webinar that we did in conjunction with the International Solid Waste Association, which is basically the larger umbrella of what Outputs, the Solid Waste Association of North America here in the US, and also EXPRO, which is Extended Producer Responsibility Alliance, which is an alliance of the packaging PROs of nonprofits in Europe. So we had a couple of experts on eco-modulated fees, and that is a free webinar. The recording will be made available.
Fantastic, fantastic. I want to switch to another hot topic. I know a lot of friends that I've talked to who are zero waste folks are going crazy about how about what this person's question is. COVID is throwing a wrench into reducing single use. Any thoughts on how to stop this trend? I know a lot of us have seen this, and it's been heartbreaking to see how much more material is being used. Jamie, we haven't heard from you in a while.
Yeah, I think it's actually even changed my own views. So in the beginning, we were pressuring, for instance, restaurants and places and stores to let us bring our own containers for them to fill up. But then with COVID, the heightened risk of contamination became apparent, and they said no. So that's a squash. So I think that we were addressing it the wrong way, begging stores to let us bring our own containers so we could take it back and then bring it in again. I think that the answer, the solution is, and that's coming forward, is that really it's up to the stores and the outlets to supply the reusable systems. They need to start doing centralized reusable systems. They need to take care of it for us because we're their consumer, and they need to be able to respond to our demands instead of us begging to let us bring in our own container. So I think that that's going to come from it, because that's the discussion that I've been having a lot lately. So yeah, it went to massive single use at first, but I think that if we keep talking about pushing them to set up their own systems that are safe and sanitized, then that's the direction we want to go in. I always talk about shifting our resources, which means not only financially, but our discussions, which is why I always talk about reuse and refill. Aside from recycling, I shift my resources in terms of my time here. So I want to do that and say, yes, we can get there.
Miriam, I'd really like to go to you because I know that your organization put a lot of work into this and did some press releases around it or some email blasts. So why don't you talk about what you guys are promoting?
Now, we've been doing a lot of communicating on this. You can go to upstreamsolutions.org for our COVID resources page. So I'd just like to say that mostly this is an issue that we're battling a misinformation and misunderstanding issue here, because and that has been partly fueled by the plastics industry, but also many public health officials who are espousing that somehow single-use disposable products are safer during this pandemic than reusables. And that's just not borne out by the science. The science says that the virus is transmitted through aerosolized droplets. There's no evidence that people are getting this virus from touching surfaces. And also the science shows that even if you believe that, the virus lasts longest on plastics and other smooth materials like metals. So really, in terms of say food service and being able to bring your own cup or bring your own reusable bag, we understand that health officials are really trying to protect the public, and they're using an abundance of caution approach, but disposables are no safer. They can be handled many more times, and they don't go through the sanitation process that, say, a reusable dish or cup that a restaurant provides you goes through. So we're trying to focus on getting accurate information out there in the hands of consumers. The Restaurant Association the National Restaurant Association isn't recommending single use for food service in this country, and many of the guidances from the FDA and even the CDC are not showing that single-use products are safer or not recommending them. So we are seeing somewhat of a change. We're seeing a lot of governors that put reusable bag policies on hold, reversing those orders. And we're also seeing at the local level here in California and in other states, a reversion back to allowing customers to bring their bags into grocery stores, reusable bags, and also walking back on some of the language around disposable foodware is better. But it's kind of a mixed bag on the disposable foodware. One last point I'll say is even Starbucks has reversed its policy, not for the US, unfortunately, but they announced, I think it was last week, they were one of the first to say no personal cups, no reusable cups can be brought into our cafes. And they've reversed that for pretty much everywhere except for the US. I'd really like to ask Starbucks, if you're on this call, on this webinar, like, why not the US? But anyway, so I think it's a misunderstanding, and we have a communications battle going on here. We had over about 125 public health experts sign on to a statement saying that reusables are no less safe than disposables. Disposables don't provide any more protection. So I think we need to go with the experts here.
Hey, does anyone else want to weigh in on it? Ruth, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of follow on with Jamie, that I do think the small silver lining of the resistance to bring your own is the innovation that we are seeing in the reusable and refillable arena. So we're working on a pilot locally that will be reusable foodware at restaurants that folks bring home and have curbside pickup. And I can definitely see on a citywide basis having curbside pickup of reusables, just like we have curbside pickup of recycling. So I think that there's a huge opportunity for innovation, and there are a lot of companies that are working on this right now, which again leads me to that, you know, make room for entrepreneurs, make room for new industries, make room for innovation, and things at the most local level, where we do have the trust, where we do have the control, I think is the opportunity that we have in zero waste.
Great. Okay, well, I think I'm going to switch topic to another question from the audience here, which is durability is key for many products. Are there any examples of policies that do that? Heidi, I think one of the first ones that comes to mind was the battery in electronics. Maybe you're thinking of another one.
Actually, about Gillette and shavers. So in Europe, they had a single producer responsibility program, and the Chinese were selling a cheap razor against the Braun razor, and they had no take back program. And then when they put in the EPR system, because the cheap razors kept boomeranging back like every 10 or 2 years, and the Brauns were durable for about 12 years, but they were more expensive because they were higher quality. The playing field got more even as far as the product price, because then all of a sudden they had to internalize all those costs of this thing coming back every 2 years. And then the product price went up and was much more fair for Braun. And so that's an example of why you don't want companies to be able to externalize all the costs onto government and to the environment, because the product price is not sending an accurate market signal. It's not the whole cost of the product. And if you don't want to socialize costs, you have to internalize it, and the person that's buying that product and benefiting from that product and making the choice to buy that product pays the full life cycle price. And then you don't have the end of life problems either, because the cost is already covered, and we don't have the illegal dumping because they have to pay to go bring it somewhere. So that's I thought a good
Great.
example.
Perfect. Does anybody else have any examples of policies that prioritize durability? Jamie?
Yeah, there's policies that I've seen coming out in Europe that have mandated extended warranties, so mandated warranties on large appliances. So ensuring that the producers are responsible, and also making sure that they have to hold parts for those products for a certain number of years to ensure that they can be repaired.
Fantastic. Any others? Miriam and then Scott.
I'll just add that one point, which is, I mean, we are iterating policies. We have several, about 7 in California that are prioritizing reusables in food service. But what we are seeing is a need to define durability or reusability, because that is that's kind of where the rubber hits the road. Because if we characterize product, because we are starting to see the plastics industry try to characterize things that we commonly view as single use as things that can be reusable, and so we need some definition over durability and reusability. And from my perspective, it's all about how the consumer will treat the product. If the consumer treats the product as a single-use product, it's not durable. If they're just going to end up putting it in waste management, some waste management system, then it's not reusable, it's not durable. Even if the industry is saying, well, we conducted an analysis and it can be used 500 times, it's all about how the consumer treats it.
Okay, Scott, I think you wanted to weigh in, and then Clarissa.
I just wanted to give a shout out to US PIRG and their reuse legislation that they've been promoting around the country. First of all, we have to remove the barriers that producers have been using to stop consumers from reusing their equipment, particularly electronics equipment. So you have Apple and others that have made it impossible for the reuse of their products. So first we need to make sure that that's not allowed. And then we need to make sure that they pay themselves for all the equipment that's being thrown, so the cords and the power, everything that we have to throw out for new generations of equipment. We haven't done that yet. It hasn't gone back, the financial signal. Those can be in better enforced EPR laws, but I think the electronics laws are long overdue here in the United States. I know we're off the packaging topic, but this is one directly related to reuse or durables in that way. So it's really to foster more reuse and take away some of the impediments.
Okay, great. Before Clarissa jumps in, I want to remind all of you that we're looking for, a list of the top 3. So be jotting down your notes and be ready in a few minutes. We're almost ready to head into wrap up. Clarissa, durability. I think you're on mute. Try again. Oh, that's terrible. We can't hear you. Okay. Does anybody, maybe if Bob is listening, maybe he can try to tackle this one. I can't see.
Yeah, I'm looking at it, Susan. See if I can.
Great. Thank you. Okay, great. So I'm going to move on to another question. This will be the last question, just in interest of time, because we've got to head into our wrap up. So the last question is, how much responsibility for plastic waste management can public interest groups and government agencies agree to delegate to private industry? I see.
Clarissa, are you back with us?
Look, so I'm going to read it. Oh, do you want to go ahead, Clarissa, before I read that question again?
Well, just really quickly on the durability thing with regards to reuse, I think we have to be really careful. I have lots of examples of companies that are putting plastic forks on the shelves in packets saying these are reusable plastic forks. This is all sort of gearing up in Europe, at least, for getting out of those responsibilities. We just conducted a study of studies, like the most comprehensive study of life cycle assessments on reusable packaging probably ever done, with the goal of attaining from there a clear understanding of what are the minimum criteria for reuse. What is that minimum that rotation? How much do you have to get back? What does those transportation distances look like? So we'll keep an eye on that, and we're doing that to inform policymakers so that at least if they're going to put targets out there or in some way, talk about reuse in any form of legislation, that we can put a little bit of a fence around it to say, anything outside of this, that ain't reuse. If you're just getting it back, if you're getting 50% back and they're reusing them, that's just not a sustainable reuse model, so that doesn't qualify. So hopefully that will help to frame how we define what's reuse and what's really not effective reuse.
Okay, great. So back to this last question. How much responsibility for plastic waste management can public interest groups and government agencies agree to delegate to private industry? Ruth.
I was going to say, in terms of plastic pollution specifically, Zero Waste USA is a sponsor of a coalition called the Albatross Coalition, and we are actually looking for a local government or someone with a beach or someone with a cleanup area to actually prove to the brand owners that it is their responsibility for cleaning up their products. So we would really like to seek out a partner to demonstrate that, you know, Coke, Nestle, Unilever, these are your products. You need to take responsibility for them. You need to clean them up or not have them in the environment. So absolutely, I think we'd be looking for sending a bill to the producers of these branded packaging.
Great. Anybody else on that last question?
Yeah, I think probably everyone would say 100% when it comes to the cleanup. And all costs should be accounted for. So, you know, manpower, disposal, everything.
Okay, so I'm going to give a shout out real quickly to the Udall Lowenthal bill, the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. And the reason I'm going to do that isn't because I'm saying that it's the model or it's the perfect bill, but it is a bill that has made an attempt to incorporate a lot of these concepts that have been discussed on this webinar. And it was really the first one that tried to put all the pieces together and tried to put all of those concepts in. I've been using it as a part of a project I've been working on this last week. So I've gotten an even greater appreciation for how much is in that bill, whether it's perfect or not, whether, you know, pieces still need to be worked on because there are holes or mismatches. But for people on this webinar who are interested in these topics, it gives you a place to go and read and see an example of how some of these concepts might be laid out in an actual piece of legislation. So now we're moving into wrap up. If everybody could give the top 3 ideas, who's ready? Who wants to jump into this? Heidi does. Heidi, what did you come up with?
Well, I think one of the things that I think people might be able to agree on, and I don't want to presuppose what the commission's going to do, because obviously that's very important. The commission does its work, but we collect things in basically 3 streams: trash, organics, and recyclables. If we can clearly identify on labels what is recyclable, compostable, and trash, that makes it really easy for consumers to sort things correctly. So in the labeling committee, I suspect we're going to see some recommendations. They're starting to brew now on proper labeling, because we are required under the law as well to define recyclable, compostable. And if we've got those and then we know what's trash, then we can actually label them. And I don't think there's a producer out there that wants to label their stuff as trash. So that might be a nice incentive. And I call it truth in labeling, because we were just working all year on the flushable wipes bill when these are not flushable at all, and they should never have been labeled flushable. And unfortunately, it blew up because of COVID and got caught in the crossfire by mistake. But we had a negotiated deal, and that really taught me the big companies can come to the table and agree on labeling. And I really hope that at least we can start with that, because chasing arrows are not working, and it's not recyclable. So that to me is a very big one I'd like to see tackled.
Great, thank you, Heidi. It looks like Ruth wants to go next. Ruth.
Yeah, I feel like in the conversation we have a lot of consensus around recycled content as as working. It has worked in many cases. I think we could have more of that. I think there is a lot of consensus around recycled content legislation. I think there's a lot of consensus around bans. Bans can work. We've seen them work. I do think that's something from an NRC perspective, we really want to continue to pursue. And then with regards to EPR or producer responsibility, I really think the examples of razors, pharmaceuticals, paint, mattresses, the hard to recycle materials, it seems to me there is a lot of consensus around. So I've heard on this, on this webinar today, a lot of consensus around those issues.
Great. Who wants Miriam? Miriam, go ahead.
think I heard a lot of consensus around the idea that we need to do waste prevention first, and then figure out what we're going to do with the rest that can't be unpackaged, i.e. reduced, can't be refillable and reusable, or just banned away and eliminated. So I think prioritizing that first, and then figuring out appropriate methods for managing the rest. But I wanted to ask Heidi, have to ask this. I've been dying to ask this of you all webinar. You know, how do we identify what's recyclable at the state level when what's recyclable happens, what's compostable happens, is very different from one jurisdiction to another? When I've been iterating with local government policies around reducing single-use in food service, and they want to know, and they want to say what the disposables look like, we've developed a kind of a reality test and said that it's local government that has to decide what is recyclable and what's compostable, because each jurisdiction is different. So they have to create local lists of what products are recyclable and what's compostable. So how does that jive with having a statewide system for labeling? I don't know.
A great question, and I think, and the Commission's, you know, considering this right now. And I know that part of the discussion has been that we actually set a level of, like, overall statewide, 80% of the systems can recycle it or compost it. So we may end up with that sort of having to track at that level, but I don't know how else we would do it. So, but who knows? We have a lot of smart people out there that hopefully will provide us comments. So if anybody's got ideas on that, please send them in and we'll consider them. But that's what I'm hearing right now is probably the way to go.
So we haven't heard from Scott or Clarissa or Jamie on this last roundup kind of thing. Clarissa, go ahead.
So definitely there's consensus on the content thing, and I was really happy to hear that everybody kind of agrees this chemical recycling, polymer to fuel versus a little bit of chemical recycling, that it's polymer to polymer, which is treated differently. But there's definitely consensus that should never be considered as recycled content, and I'm really happy to hear that. I was also really happy to hear, since we're more of an international organization, that there's agreement that whatever the definitions and the certifications have to be sort of harmonized ultimately to the highest degree and not the lowest common denominator between Europe and America, because of course it's a global traded commodity, so we all have to be speaking the same language. I just want, my last point is to say, we didn't really talk about it, but I think everybody agrees that one of the greatest failings of EPR that we have seen happen all over the world is that lack of government oversight and monitoring and independent monitoring and thoughtful methodologies for measuring performance and actually having in the law properly defined performance. I'm an advocate of a non-prescriptive EPR bill, and I know there could be a whole hours of debate on this, but I really truly believe, like, tell producers what they have to do, set the targets effing high as you can, at least what's reasonable and based on some best practice, and let them go at it. That is a very purist opinion of EPR, and I know it has its controversy, but I'll just finally say, I get that the Waste Management has done a lot of investment, but they shouldn't be driving this discussion. They are service providers, and it's the leaders in that field that will pivot and provide the new and enhanced service. The fact that they are having to, and I'm sorry, and I totally hear you, Heidi, like without them, these bills will never go through, but we have to remember these are service providers. And if we want to have totally different systems and reuse systems, these very companies, leaders are going to pivot and they're going to start delivering those services. And we have to remember that the worst waste management sector should not drive these discussions. And then I'll stop.
I'll just say that that may be the case, but politically, with the amount of money that and the connections that they have, it's not politically possible. So that's where what's reality and our political reality versus what might be ideal or just maybe not aligned right now.
Yeah, but I would also say that, you know, you've got a wall of the waste management sector, which is basically an oligopoly, sort of controlling things and they have a ton of power, but we need to work on those parts of that oligopoly, those companies that may be a little bit more forward thinking, and we need to try to erode that front. And you know, we've done it with the beverage sector. I mean, I've been doing this for 25 years. We're finally eroding that wall that is anti-deposit, which used to be, you know, material suppliers, all the brands and the retailers, and now it's just the retailers and a couple of dinosaur brands. It's unbelievable. So I think that if we want to tackle that issue, we need to find the more forward thinking, you know, in Europe, you know, we're talking about the Suezes and the Romandises, which are slowly starting to see that there's a whole other field of business there, and they need to start supporting policies that will force them to shift.
Great. So on to Jamie for your wrap-up thoughts, and then Scott, you're going to get the last word.
I think it's safe to say that you know, we should always look at the intention of all the policies. So if we're looking at, you know, resource conservation or managing effective management of resources right from extraction, we should really state that and talk about reuse and reduction in the policies. Also, I think that the conversations and our energy should be more focused on reduction and reuse. We talk about it a lot, obviously, but I still hear you know, 50% or more of the conversation focusing on recycling and how to recycle single-use products, when we should really be focusing on how to get reusable systems in place and refillable systems and reduce those volumes. I think that's key. I also hear that we're talking about, when we're talking about bans or anything like that, we're talking about the intention again, which is not necessarily single-use plastics, but we want to make sure that we're talking about all single-use products and focus on how to reduce that as well. And then lastly, I think we should shoot for the stars. So you know, if your main focus is going to be strictly on recycling, your only other options are disposal after that. So I think we should shoot a lot higher, again, reuse and reduction of waste.
Great, Scott, for your final comments on where we have consensus.
So I don't need to repeat what's been said about reuse, source reduction, and other things. I agree with all of that, and recycled content. Just one comment from Clarissa's. I agree with Clarissa as well in terms of what's worked and what hasn't. We've seen, though, systems, EPR, we're talking about packaging systems, you know, in Canada, where you have Quebec, it took them 15 years from one system to another to transition. And around the world, you have so much more experience than us. We're just mere babies here on EPR for packaging, unfortunately. And I think it's going to take, we're going to take those lessons and move them as far as we can. And that's what we're trying to do. So your experience would be helpful. I just want to end here with maybe a challenge to NRC here. I'm not hearing full consensus. Maybe everybody, maybe not Ruth here. I don't know where NRC is on supporting EPR for packaging. I have been legislatively appointed to a commission in Connecticut on packaging. I have spoken before multiple commissions, and Susan, you and I were on a task force this morning. It's been a long day for you in Maryland, and they're all well-intentioned, but without political will, without leadership of somebody, the chair of a committee, or someone saying, we're going to do EPR for packaging, it waffles, and it takes a really long time. And so I would like the NRC to come out with a statement of what they can support in terms of EPR for packaging. I think it's really important that the zero waste, the source reduction, the reuse is all folded in to this policy, which is blazing around the country very quickly right now. And I don't want to see the NRC left behind on this. I'd like to see NRC weighed in, and I'd like to have the discussions that we need to have in order to get on the same page and to understand one another about what is possible with these systems and where we want to go and how we can work together on them. And so that, I don't hear that as a full consensus before us, but I think that intent is really important. And I would pledge PSI's resources to work with you and to see how we might be able to get on the same page and have those discussions.
Fantastic. Well, we're down to just 1 minute left until our scheduled ending time. I also want to mention that we have so many questions that we were not able to get to from the audience that we could literally do this again for 2 hours and just go through their questions, and it would, that's how many questions we have left. So there's a tremendous amount of interest in this topic, and I'm sure that the audience really, really appreciated all of you as panelists. Thank you so much for bringing your expertise to this event for such a high-level discussion on all of these different policies. We really appreciate it at NRC, and I feel like this has given us the guidance that we wanted from a town hall, but I almost really want to do it again with all of the questions that were coming in, because there's so much more involvement we could get from these 100 other people that are part of this conversation. So thank you, Heidi and Scott and Ruth and Clarissa and Jamie and Miriam. Thank you so much. And to everybody who was on this webinar for this whole time, we still have 74 people. Thank you so much for participating in this town hall with us. And please come back and join us for the remainder of the NRC webinars, and please come and see even more from many of these same speakers at the National Zero Waste virtual conference in early December, which you can see where to register for that on the National Recycling Coalition webpage. And Bob, with that, I turn it over to you for closing out.
I just wanted to thank you all. A really fantastic webinar, and I'm looking forward to the next one. Thank you, everybody.
Next week, same time.
Thank you for having us.
Let's do it in person
Thanks.
next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right.
Good job, Susan.
Next one's in 2 weeks.
Thank you, Gary.